Please welcome Adele Onyango.
My mother was an accountant by training, and she knew how to be a best friend to my sisters who loved math and science, and to me who loved poetry, which you'd assume is not an accountant's first love. But she would spend hours reading poetry with me. This was a lady who, whenever I'd tell her I love her, she would respond by saying, "I'll love you until the end of time." I went to primary school in Nairobi, Kenya. And one day at school, I was about 9 years old, during break time, a kid in school came up to me and said, "Oh, your mom has cancer. You know she's going to die, right?" I immediately started crying hysterically. I knew my mom had cancer. She spoke about it in the media and in the school circles to raise awareness on this disease. But she carried it like it was a flu. So this was the first time that I was faced with the reality of this disease could rob me of my mom. My big sister went to the same school, and she also doubled up as my bodyguard. And so she saw the commotion and came and confronted the kid. Later that night, because in primary school there are no secrets, my mom found out about the break time fiasco, and she sat us all down, and she told us that she was going to be okay, and that we mustn't listen to anyone but her when it came to matters of her health. Over the next few months, my mom went through treatment, and sometimes I could see it was taking a toll on her. But she never once cried about it in front of me. She always had this deep smile as if to say everything was going to be okay. So in turn, I never cried about it. I didn't want her to think that her situation was breaking me. And besides, if she wasn't crying, then I shouldn't. Sometimes it was tough, like on my 10th birthday. We celebrated it in hospital because mom had been admitted, which was different from what would normally happen, where my mom would buy 2 packets of eclair sweets, a cake, bring them to school, and then her, my teacher, my classmates, and I would sing happy birthday. This time around, I was surrounded by gray walls, green scrubs, the strong smell of medicines, and nurses who were singing happy birthday, but if you look closely, they were just counting down to the end of their shift. I wanted to cry for me, I wanted to cry for my mom, but she wasn't crying, and she was the one who was admitted, so I didn't. And that began the pattern. I didn't cry when she was puking because of the chemotherapy. I didn't cry when the cancer came back a second and a third time. But even through all of that, she was still there for me. She was there when, in campus, I started an open mic night where poets and musicians would come and perform. She never once missed any show. She was there when I got my first job as a radio presenter and guided me through my contract. And once she saw exactly how much I was going to be making, assigned me a bill in the house, and I had to pay for the home Wi-Fi. One Saturday morning, when I was about 3 years into my radio presenter job, I was going to try yoga for the very first time. I was on the stairway getting ready to leave with my bag full of everything I was told one needs for yoga. Suddenly, my sister got out of her room and she was on the phone. She was crying and she kept saying no over and over and over again. She didn't need to tell me. I knew my mom was dead. I went back into my room and dropped my yoga bag and picked up my duvet, and I went down to the living room to wait for the influx of people who would be coming to say sorry to us. This time around, I didn't cry because I didn't want my sisters to worry about me, the youngest, the baby. I'd noticed that every time that I'd start to cry, they would get much more emotional and cry 10 times harder. And I carried this fight on for 6 years, a fight to appear strong and appear okay. Sometimes I'd cry when I was alone and when I was at work, but I could control my tears and stop them when I needed to. In my culture, after the funeral, one must have a memorial, which is a small graveside mass where you unveil the cross or the tombstone. It's a very serious occasion, so very many WhatsApp groups were opened to talk about different things from, will we cook for ourselves or hire a caterer? Will we hire a choir or not? My sisters and I were responsible for the grave. We basically had to make it look good, which meant we had to get flowers, flower pots, and the tombstone. We got beautiful white swan-shaped flower pots and filled them with flowers that didn't need much watering because the gardener at home is very forgetful. And we got a big, beautiful black marble tombstone that shimmered every time the sunlight caught it. This tombstone needed to be inscribed with a poem or a quote. Now, in my family, I am the family-appointed wordsmith. Something about me being a poet and working in radio makes my family think I'm good with words. So I had to cloak my mother's legacy and what she meant to us in 4 lines, and I had 2 weeks to do this. So the first time I tried to write this poem, I took my favorite notebook and I sat upright at my dining table and I switched off all my phones and I began to write. But I'd cancel off all the sentences before I even finished them. After about 10 minutes of doing this, I realized, okay, maybe I'm just not in the right mood today. So I stopped. The second time I tried to write this poem, again I took my favorite notebook. This time I thought maybe I should sit somewhere where I'm more comfortable, my bed. So I got into bed and I began to write. And 1 word in, tears started hitting my notebook. I shut my eyes to try and trap the tears in, but it was like they weren't listening to the small voice in my head that was commanding them back to where they came from. It was like my tears were rebelling against me. So very different from any time I'd cried before. At this point, I wasn't just crying, I was letting out a huge wail. I was very exhausted, and I clenched my fists and tried to hold my breath so that I could suffocate the wail. And my mind was full of different thoughts. Why is this so painful? Is this what weakness feels like? What if my neighbors hear me? What if my husband comes home early and this freaks him out? I opened my eyes and I could feel just how puffy my eyes had gotten, and my throat was dry and I was drained. But what was interesting is I felt stronger and a huge sigh of relief. And it was almost like the tears had cleared what was stopping me from seeing the words. The words that my mom would always tell me when I'd tell her, I love you. She would always say, I love you until time stands still. So those are the words on her tombstone.